The way in which Creative Assembly has been handling their information drips to the Total War public has been undoubtedly a double-edged sword. On the one hand, CA has been very transparent in my opinion, and I think it's hard to argue that point. Whether you absolutely despise the Chaos DLC or not, they could have sprung it on us a couple of weeks before release, leaving you much less time to decide whether such business practices were a deal breaker for you. They're going to be giving YouTubers access to the game months in advance to try out the full campaign and get very familiar with how the game works and how well the game runs. And trust me when I say that YouTubers are going to be giving you an indication on whether this game is worth the purchase or not. They've made the difference between in-engine trailers and gameplay trailers very clear as well, and while this might be very obvious to some consumers, mostly YouTubers, I think, people who watch YouTube videos, that difference is sometimes lost on more casual gamers. So we've gotten boatloads of information over the last few months, from full gameplay with the battle at the Thundering Falls to information on how legendary lords and heroes will work. They've told us explicitly that while the Empire will only be starting with 3 of the 8 colleges of magic, which are going to be the Lore of Metal, the Lore of Heavens, and the Lore of Light, all 8 will be released over time as free downloads, so by the end of the 3rd game, at the latest, we're going to have all 8 colleges of magic for the Empire. Of course, there's a whole lot more that we've learned, but basically everything they've been talking about so far, I think they've been pretty upfront with, and I think they're doing pretty well in that regard, in my opinion. What this influx of information means, though, is that CA is going to continually open themselves up to criticism on the wave of backlash from the Chaos DLC announcement. We just got a look at what's being called the full unit roster for the Empire, so before we get into what my opinions on the roster are, let's first take a look at the roster itself. So for Legendary Lords, we have the Emperor Karl Franz, the Prince of Altdorf, and the Spiritual Heart of the Empire, and we have Balthazar Gelt, the Gold Wizard. For Lords, we have just a generic General of the Empire, Melee General. For Heroes, we have Captain of the Empire, Warrior Priest, Witch Hunter, Celestial Wizard, which uses the Lore of Heavens, and a Light Wizard, which uses the Lore of Light. For mounts, we're going to have Deathclaw, that can only be used by Karl Franz, a Warhorse, a Barded Warhorse, Imperial Pegasus, and Imperial Griffin. For melee infantry, we're going to have Halberdiers, Spearmen, Swordsmen, Spearmen with shields, and great swords. For missile infantry, we're going to have Crossbowmen, Handgunners. For melee cavalry, we're going to have Reichsguard, and Demigryph Knights, and Demigryph Knights with halberds. And for missile cavalry, we'll have Pistoliers, Outriders, and Outriders with grenade launchers. Vehicles will include the Luminarch of Hysh, and the Steam Tank. And artillery will include the Great Cannon, Hellblaster Volley Gun, and Hellstorm Rocket Battery. So there are some things missing from this unit roster that I think are pretty important. Off the top of my head, Archers, Flagellants, and Mortars are 3 units that immediately spring to my mind that come straight from the tabletop game, and these are all core units of the Empire that each fulfill a role not currently seen in the Empire roster. Archers are a very cheap alternative to crossbows that would be very useful against lightly armored foes like the Beastmen or Chaos Marauders. Flagellants are a meat shield unit used to soak up fire and damage for the more important state troops, and this is honestly a role that the Empire is currently lacking. Right now they have to use state troops to go in first. They don't really have anything to just soak up a bunch of fire and have their opponents waste ammunition on. I can see the Flagellants getting added later on if we see Volkmar the Grim, the Grand Theogenes, become a Legendary Lord, but currently they're not in, and I'm not really sure why. Mortars are also a very important part of the Empire. They fulfill a very important tactical role in sieges. They're the only piece of artillery I can think of that can fire over walls and cover and hit units directly behind a building or a gate or tower. This makes them very useful at killing bunched up infantry in offensive and defensive siege battles. And the Hellstorm rocket batteries and the Hellbuster volley gun are infantry killers to be sure, but they need line of sight, and the mortar doesn't. The Great Cannon, of course, is going to be the artillery piece designed to breach walls, and will certainly not be able to fire directly over cover and hit units behind. But those are 3 of the units. One of the things that I was really most excited for when looking at the Empire roster were going to be the Knightly Orders. I think they add a lot of very cool flavor and a regal air to the Empire unit roster. And currently they're just missing almost completely. So the Knights Panther, the Knights of the Blazing Sun, the Tübingen Guard from Middenheim, these units would have all added a bunch of flavor to the Empire's melee cavalry selection, and instead, right now, we just have Reichsguard and Demigryph Knights and Demigryph Knights with halberds, and that's it. And it's not that Demigryphs aren't a very flavorful and cool unit, they definitely are, they're awesome, and I'm really glad they made it into the game. But just looking at the cavalry selection, the melee cav selection for the Empire, there should be more than 2 units. Tübingen Guard, for example, are Knights of the White Wolf that ride into battle with huge beards, full plate armor, and these massive 2-handed warhammers they wield from horseback. CA already has a base skeleton for that. It's just a cavalry unit with a man on horseback. But suddenly you add Tübingen Guard, and the cavalry selection looks that much more flavorful with the addition. Again, I didn't expect all Knightly Orders to be in the game at launch, but 3 are different orders at least. I don't think that's too much to ask for. We might see all of them when Kurt Helborg, the Reichsmarschall and Captain of the Reichsguard, is added as a legendary lord, but right now I just don't think that 2 melee cavalry variants for the Empire is cutting it. I'm fine with stuff like Master Engineers and some of the Knightly Orders and the province-specific units like Hochland Long Rifles, Karlberg Great Swords, Nuln Pikemen or Artillery. All that stuff can get added later. I don't think that's essential. But I just find 1 Knightly Order and only 2 variants of melee cavalry pretty sparse for a faction known for having a wide selection of powerful heavy cavalry. For this discussion, I think it's important to remember a quote from Creative Assembly when talking about Warhammer. They explicitly said, and I quote verbatim, "In the case of Warhammer, we want it all. All the races, all the units, all the magic, as authentically as we can possibly make it, with the best possible TW gameplay in there too. We're doing 4 races so we can go deep rather than wide, fleshing out each race." Now that of course does not preclude the arrival of units via free LC or DLC later on, and the addition of units and features over the lifespan of all 3 games. We want that. That's the kind of thing that's going to make us keep coming back for each game afterwards. But basically, Creative Assembly narrowed it down to only 4 races so they could go very deep and really flesh out everything in detail, and that includes, or at least should include, the unit roster for those 4 races: Vampire Counts, Greenskins, Dwarfs, and the Empire. One of, if not the most attractive thing for a faction in a Total War game is the unit rosters for that faction. There might very well be more units for the Empire in campaign not announced on this roster, and there might very well be a bunch of extra campaign features that justify skipping out on some important units. And there might very well be valid financial reasons the Knightly Orders and Mortars and such aren't on this roster list yet, and there might be more Empire roster announcements or surprises as we get closer to release. Remember guys, we are still 5 months away from release, so those of you who are complaining, where are the Vampire Counts? I understand you're excited for Vampire Counts. I am too. They're the faction I want to play the most in Warhammer at the start. But we're 5 months away. They can't show everything right away. We're going to see Vampire Counts before release. They're not hiding anything from us. They're spreading it out over the long period of time before the game comes out. With all that said, though, looking solely at this unit roster for the Empire, a unit roster that says full unit roster, I'm not that impressed. I'm honestly kind of disappointed. They explicitly said, looking at Total War Warhammer, we want it all. We want all the units. We're doing 4 factions so that we can go deep rather than wide, as in not adding a bunch of races that aren't fully fleshed out yet. I don't think it's ridiculous for people to think that each race unit roster will be really well fleshed out when there are only 4 races. This Empire roster doesn't really feel super well fleshed out to me. And clearly there's some agreement on this forum and on YouTube on that front. Like the Total War forums, and there's some agreement there. There's some agreement on YouTube. You look at Oakley's channel, his newest video, that kind of stuff. There is some agreement that this roster is kind of lackluster. And it's not just from people who were angry at the Chaos DLC, but from people who defended it or were ambivalent about it, or had a different perspective on it, like I did. Obviously, not everyone agrees on this issue. Some people are going to be very happy with the Empire roster, and that's completely cool. But there are plenty of people right now who find this roster somewhat lackluster, given what CA said. So, Would adding 2 or 3 more Knightly Orders and Flagellants and a Mortar cost CA money and resources? Absolutely. Of course it would. Would it have been too much for the development team to add on release to further flesh out a roster for a faction that currently only has 2 melee cavalry variants? And remember, this is a faction that is known for being very well balanced and having impressive heavy cavalry and a large assortment of them. I seriously doubt that'd be too much for them. There has to come a point where we stop trying to justify lack of so-and-so because it costs money. It is a AAA game, it is a AAA developer, and this franchise is going to be a cash cow. CA can afford to add mortars and archers and Tübingen Guard without breaking the bank or hurting their financial reports. And suddenly, if those units are added, this roster is starting to look a lot more appealing. Personally, it's just lacking some flavor right now, in my opinion. As I said, we're still 5 months from release. Creative Assembly cannot and will not spoil everything for us before we get there. I think that some of us, and myself included, are getting a little bit over-anxious, a little bit over-hyped, and starting to become very impatient in a game that is still nowhere near release, and of course they're not going to spoil everything 5 months away from the time the game is released. So from that standpoint, I understand everything. I'm not panicking yet. I'm not seething in anger at this Empire roster at all. I'm excited for Total War Warhammer, and I think it's going to be a great game, but I have to say, when your marketing consistently talks about going deep rather than wide, I expect to see that reflected in the unit rosters, which, in my opinion, are some of the most important features in a Total War game, maybe the most important feature. So currently, and this may change over the next few months, I think that it might, I'm not seeing the depth in this Empire roster. I think that it's lacking some kind of important stuff, and I'd like to see more variety, and I'd like to see that variety on launch, not added a couple of months after the game's release. We do know that free LC is going to sustain life of this game. We do know that the Lords of Magic are going to get added freely later on down the road. But I do think that this unit roster needs a little bit more before release to really flesh it out. That's my opinion. Not everyone has to agree with it. And I don't think this is a catastrophic sham over a unit roster either. I really don't. But I did expect to see a little bit better, and hopefully there's going to be more on release in the form of, or if it's not there at release, I'm okay, I guess, with free LC stuff coming very soon after release, but it has to come soon, in my opinion. But either way, that's my opinion on the unit roster. I think it could be better. I think it's not terrible. The core stuff is mostly there. Knightly Orders are definitely lacking. Mortars should be there. Archers should be there. Flagellants should be there. But post your guys' opinions below. I'm definitely interested in what you guys think of this so far. And I'll talk to you all soon.